Welcome to the latest edition of Are You Live? Tonight we have a special guest, Donald Hoffman, Professor Donald Hoffman of UC Irvine. I am going to mute people right now because they are making noise. Actually, if you can mute yourselves, please do that. I don't have time and I don't have Landry with me. So Don was on Unregistered several months ago, and we talked about some very heady stuff: reality, truth, science, history of science, space and time, moving beyond space and time, crazy stuff. We also talked about our fathers. Don's father was a preacher, holy roller preacher, and my father was a scientistic, ex-religious person who came to science as his own religion, as a new religion. But what I didn't talk about with you, and I'd like to talk about today, is I want to talk about your field, your academic field. I know you started elsewhere, but cognitive science as a discipline has been very interesting to me. And it's a relatively new field, right?
Yes.
And I'm just really curious about that. I don't know the history of it. I used to teach at Occidental College, and I told you that they had a very, very good, for a small college, they had a large cog sci department. And it was sort of the first time I'd become aware of it as a field. And this would have been in the early 2010s. And this was when I started having students come to my classes and making arguments based on what they called brain scans. And they would tell me, well, there's this new study with brain scans that show this or that about human beings or men or women or black people or white people or Filipinos or whatever it was. And so brain scans started coming into the discourse, I noticed. And then I finally found out, I think some of this came out of cognitive science departments, right?
Yes.
So can you just tell us the history of this field? Because I have concerns about it.
Right. So the history is interesting. Psychology really got started, in the mid 1800s. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a problem? Someone? If you haven't, please mute yourself. If you haven't already, please mute.
Okay.
Everyone except for Don. Thank
Right.
you. Go ahead, Don. Sorry.
So it got going in the mid 1800s. There were brilliant labs in Germany, Fechner and Wundt and Titchener and so forth. These guys were studying experiences. So the first field was primarily focusing on consciousness and how consciousness might be related to the physical world. So the field of psychophysics was established around 1860 by Fechner, and Wundt and Titchener were studying conscious experiences and introspection and so forth, trying to make it more rigorous. And William James came along and he was very interested in consciousness. And he was brilliant, well ahead of his time. And then in the early 1900s, around 1920 or so, we pin the date there roughly, behaviorism sort of set into the field. And for the next, until I would say 1960, 1970, behaviorism really was the dominant thing. And the idea was psychology was trying to be a respectable science.
Right.
None of this squishy stuff about consciousness, nothing about mental, anything. It's just stimulus and response and so forth. But then in the 1940s and 1950s, information theory really started to take hold. We began to really get this new language of information theory, and psychologists began to realize that that language and the computer metaphor could be a really useful way of thinking about the human brain and human cognitive capacities. And in some sense, there's one big event that we could point to, but one of the events was Noam Chomsky did a critique of a book called Verbal Behavior. And that was an attempt to give just a stimulus response account of language. And Chomsky ripped it apart and showed with very, very simple, devastating logical arguments that behaviorist approaches could not deal with language. And so that was one of the critical points, but it was a number of the researchers who realized that the information theoretic revolution and the cognitive and the computer revolution that was going along with it.
Right.
So there was the mathematical theory of information, and then we were building computers that were working, and we began to realize a deep conceptual framework. And so the idea was to take the smallest step beyond behaviorism that we could take. So we will put something between the stimulus and response, but it'll be a machine.
Before you go on, can you, how are you using behaviorism?
The idea that, for example, that Skinner and others had was that we should be good scientists by only looking at stimuli that are observable and responses that are observable. And talking about anything inside the organism was not acceptable. Those were unobservable states. And so we should be good scientists and only talk about what can be publicly observed. So that was sort of the idea.
And this was in part, wasn't it a reaction to psychoanalysis?
It was in part a reaction to psychoanalysis. I think it was also in part a reaction to an emphasis on consciousness. And so William James was very, very happy to talk about consciousness and mental states. And Skinner and others were not. So that's, Thorndike he didn't want any of these internal mental states. They just wanted to be what they thought was going to be, kosher scientific approaches. So no consciousness.
What is measurable in part, right? Is what is taken seriously.
Absolutely. What is publicly observable. So what a person is doing, maybe their pulse, where they're looking, what exactly they're saying. Those are the kinds of things, anything that's physiological that you can measure, behaviors that you can measure, but mental states that, those, no. Now, neurophysiological states, they weren't really able to measure much, maybe EEGs, but not like with the brain imaging we've got now. Mm-hmm. But they would certainly take that as part of what's an observable public measurable thing, right? Your fMRI, EEG, MEG, and so forth. So cognitive science really got started in the 50s and 60s, writing on the information revolution and the success of computers and recognizing that there was a new metaphor that we could use to discuss human intelligence. And of course, Turing was already asking the question, deep questions. There's the Turing test, for whether a computer was intelligent. And the question was, could you distinguish it by a Q&A from a human who was responding? If you couldn't see who you were talking to, a computer versus a person, would you be able to tell the two apart? So already the idea that this was somehow relevant to understanding humans was, in the air. And it also took off with some changes in philosophy at the time. But we can go into those. But so I would say by the 1960s, it was clearly on the rise. And by the 1970s, it was really dominant, really quite dominant. So the idea is that, to put it simply, in addition to the inputs to organisms, like visual inputs, sensory inputs more generally, and the outputs of the organisms, their behaviors, their speech, we can also talk about their internal mental states. But the internal mental states are thought of as like the internal states of a computer. So it's going to be still rigorous physical stuff, was sort of the idea, not squishy. Well, it depends. Of course, there are lots of varieties of opinions on this. Some people would start to say, well, we could talk about mental states as, and maybe not as physical mental states, just as mental states. And others were saying, no, these are internal states like the internal physical states of a computer. So there's going to be that kind of debate. But so it was, and that's where cognitive science is today, in the sense that our PhD students are making computational models of specific cognitive abilities, language understanding, visual perception, motor behavior, anger, emotions. So we're getting to the point where we can have, you know, models of emotions and motivation and so forth. And but usually you get a PhD if you're doing theoretical work. I mean, of course you get PhDs for just doing experiments. I mean, that's true too. But if you're doing theoretical work, typically it's expressed in some kind of computer program. And the idea is roughly, hey, if you want to explain how humans are doing it, build a computer. And if the computer works, well, maybe you're onto something. If you can't get a computer to work, maybe you need to go back and do your homework until we can get a computer to do that. So the attitude is no, just hand wave theories. If you can't build it, you don't know what you're talking about. Build it, and then we'll talk. Is sort of the attitude. And so it's a good hard-nosed kind of attitude. If you think for example, one technology that's come out of this is self-driving cars that can see, right? When I was a graduate student, one of the things that attracted me to the research that I did was that David Marr, who was a professor at MIT, was saying, hey, let's not just talk about vision and how vision works. Build it. Put cameras on computers. Send the pixels into the computer and have it see in 3D. If you can't do that, don't talk to me. You don't know what you're talking about yet. And so that was sort of I like that hard-nosed attitude. Build it first. Or if you're talking about object recognition, okay, build one that can actually do it, that actually can recognize 50 objects or whatever it might be. If you can't do that, then I'm not interested in your paper and pencil theory. That's sort of the attitude.
If you're watching this on YouTube and you'd like to participate in RU Live sessions or just watch them live, become a member of Renegade University by going to renegadeuniversity.com. Once you're a member, you'll also be able to watch the entire RU Live sessions on our website at renegadeuniversity.com. So go there, become a member at any level, and we'll see you there.